site, and you can go there on the weekends, and they give you a docent guided tour, and they've converted it back to World War II, what it looked like in World War II. But how this fits in with my Civil War research is
What is that called again?
Osgood Battery, which is an artillery battery, and the man's name was Osgood that they named it after. San Pedro, yeah. And on Sundays they have docent-led tours. It's a big bunker. You go down into it, and it's huge. It has trucks and jeeps, and the communication room has all the electronic radios, Morse code equipment. It's really interesting, and they do a great job. The docents do a great job of explaining it to you. But Osgood, who it was named after, when the docent started his spiel, I was standing there, and on the wall was a picture of Colonel Osgood in his big dress uniform, and I looked at it, and I was reading underneath it, and it said that he won the Medal of Honor at Gettysburg while he was serving with the 27th Maine Infantry. And so, of course, that pinged my radar because I'm a big Civil War buff, and Gettysburg is one of my favorite subjects to read about the Civil War, and I've been there to the battlefield several times. But I didn't remember ever reading about anything happening with the 27th Maine there, so I was going to research that. And this being the 21st century, most people would have just got their phone out right then and punched it in. But me, I'm old-fashioned. I waited till I got home, and I went to my bookshelf, and I pulled off a book that I knew had the organizational chart for the Union Army at Gettysburg, and I went through it, and there was no 27th Maine there. So I got out a second book I had that had it, and then no 27th Maine there. So finally I broke down, and I went into my little home office, and I punched it in the computer, and I found out how you can win the Medal of Honor for a battle that you weren't at. And I'll share that with you later. It's a very interesting story. But how that got me on to researching Tustin Civil War veterans is when I went to put those two books back, I saw this book on my shelf, and I pulled it down. I haven't looked at that in a while, and this is Pioneers in Blue and Gray, Civil War Veterans of Orange County. It's by the late Gordon Bricken. And if you ever want to do any type of research or learn about Civil War soldiers from Orange County, this is where to start. It's like the gold standard. It's got like 1,000 names they found, and right down to the GPS locations of their graves. But there's also, he couldn't do biographical sketches of all the men, but there's some. So that evening, I was sitting there just paging through it like while I was watching an Angel game, and I saw James Brown. It said James Brown, Orange. He was from Orange. It said won the Medal of Honor with the 27th Maine. And I was like, wow, what a coincidence! I mean, to see two in the same day. So I thought, I got to look into this. So I started researching James Brown, and found out he wasn't from Orange. He was from Tustin. He lived his last 40 years right down the street here on Pacific and 3rd Street. And so that got me thinking, I wonder how many other guys from Tustin served in the Civil War. So I went through this book, completely through it, and made a list. It came up with, I think, 9, maybe 10 names that I had started working on. So that was kind of the genesis of this whole project I'm doing. But then I started, at the same time, I started volunteering here at the museum a couple days a month. And while I was working on these, I shared with Donna and Steve kind of what I was doing. And I guess they let Vicki, Vicki's here somewhere. Oh, I let Vicki, they let Vicki know, and she's working on a very similar project with the Learning Center computer back there. But my emphasis was on their Civil War service and their years in Tustin. But she's doing like for early Tustin families and researching their genealogy and then putting it on the Learning Center computer so when people come in they can look up their ancestors. But we found out after talking, we were researching some of the same people, so we started sharing our information. And then Vicki did something that really helped me and just kind of doubled the amount of people I had. She went, was it the 1910 census? You extracted the names of, yeah, and she extracted the names of all these men who might have been the right age to serve in the Civil War. So I got a copy of that list, and I went through this book, and it took my number of people from 8 or 9 to about 17 names of men who served and lived in Tustin. And then since then we found a couple more. So right now I'm working on 20. I'm researching 20 different men who served in the Civil War and then lived in Tustin. And to me, that's kind of amazing for as small a town as Tustin was at that time. I mean, the time these men lived here, it was never more than probably 300 or 400 people. but yet, you know, 20 Civil War veterans ended up living here. And once we start looking at them, you'll see I was also amazed at just the diversity of their service, all the different, you know, just about every branch of service was covered. There were men who were wounded, men who were prisoners of war, one who served on a Navy battleship in the war. So there's just a whole diversity of experiences just for this small town. So I found that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about doing this research. And of the 18 names, of the 20 names, I've only come up with 2 Confederate veterans so far. So it's 18 Union men and 2 Confederates. And Vicki, as well as our sharing research, she's also kind of been like my fact-checker. She saved me from a couple mistakes already. I'll finish one of my little biographical sketches, and then I'll email it to her. She kind of edits it down for her project there, but she's also caught me on a few mistakes, so that helps. And then, yeah. And then Donna has also been very helpful. When I'm here in the museum, if I get stuck on I've got stuck on a couple research points, and I'll hand it to her and see if you can do anything with it. And she's many times been able to find something I haven't been able to. So it's been a collaborative effort, and it's been fun to do. And I've finished about 12 of the biographical sketches out of the 20 men so far. This kind of was thrown at me before, you know, because of Veterans Day. We wanted to do it this month, but I'm not completely finished yet. And the way I'm doing it is just, I've done genealogy for a lot of years. So I'm using the same method. When I get a man's name, I just use kind of the same methods I do if I were researching a family member. You know, I try to create a timeline, trying to follow their life using census records and birth, death, marriage records, voter registration. Once they got here to Tustin, we've got city directories, you know, just try to pinpoint them in time where they were. And then when I got to their Civil War service, I use things like muster rolls, regimental histories, adjutant general reports, pension files, and GAR records. The GAR was the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the main veterans group for Union Civil War soldiers. And they lobbied for pensions, and they were the men who, you know, organized the parades, the Decoration Day parades, and things like that. And every big and small town in the country usually had their GAR posts that did those things. The men from Tustin, every Union soldier so far that I've researched belonged to the GAR, and the GAR post that the men from Tustin belonged to was in Santa Ana. It was called Sedgwick Post 17. So that's kind of how I'm doing the research. As I was doing it, I would make a chart, and I wanted to see, like, when the men, at the time they enlisted, I wanted to make a chart on how old they were, what occupation they had, marital status, and where they came from. And it's allowed me to make some generalizations. For the most part, the men who enlisted were young. The youngest was 16 when he enlisted, and there were 2 other teenagers. Most of them were single, and most of them were farm laborers. In fact, every single one so far that I researched grew up working and living on a farm. And I think 8 out of the 12 that I've researched so far were working either on a family farm or working for somebody else when they enlisted. And then there were 2 blacksmiths, a carpenter, a printer, but so far no professional men. The oldest, I said the youngest was 16. The oldest veteran I've researched so far, he was 36. And he was married, and he had 2 young daughters when he enlisted. And sadly, the first year he was away in the Army, both the daughters died. And but by the end of the war, by 1865, he had a young son. So we have to assume he either went home on furlough at some point, or his wife had some explaining to do when he got home. But I'm guessing that he went home because they stayed married and for the rest of their lives and had like 4 more children. So we'll give her the benefit of the doubt after 100 and some years. So they had a broad range of experiences, but the one thing they all had in common is they all did end up here in Tustin. And Vicki and I have talked about this too. As we're looking at these things, we see some of them seem like very similar where they were. And we say, why would they pull up stakes in California? So I was, and come to Tustin. not that anything's wrong with Tustin, but Many of them had already started moving west even before the war. A lot of them were from New England, but they had moved west started moving west either with their families or by themselves. But I mean west at that time, where they went maybe from New England to Iowa or Michigan or something like that. And then after the war, they kind of incrementally moved west too. But very few of them just went straight from where they were to California. A lot of them moved to Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and then eventually they came to California. But you know, I tried to figure out like what would make them come here, and the earliest ones came in the mid 1870s when Tustin was still just a very, very small couple buildings out here. And for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the timeline of Tustin, and none of these men were from Tustin because Tustin didn't exist during the Civil War. Columbus Tustin came down from the Bay Area, and his partner Nelson Stafford. They came down to Tustin, this area, in 1868, and they bought the acreage, this land that became Tustin. And then Columbus Tustin actually moved down here with his family in like 1870 and started subdividing it and registering the plots with the county. So the city recognizes 1868 as the anniversary date of founding. Most historians pick 1870, but whichever date you pick, it was well after the Civil War. So all the men that I'm talking about being veterans of Tustin were from somewhere else and came to Tustin. There were a few that came in the mid-70s, but most of them came in the 1880s and the 1890s. And so you kind of look at what was going on. And in the mid-1880s, there was, in Southern California, there was kind of a phenomenon going on. Anybody, local history, what was going on? They call it the land boom. These land speculators they were creating new towns and subdividing, and they were trying to lure people out here. They would print up pamphlets and booklets and send them back east or to the Midwest, just telling how the climate was. Anything will grow here. You've got rheumatism, come out here and you'll be spry as a spring chicken. All to sell land, of course. But that went on through the mid 80s.
And also the railroads.
Yes, and the railroads were also very big in getting people out here. This is a great little booklet. It's an example of one of the booklets that they sent back. And this one was put together by some of the muckies from Santa Ana. So this has all kind of talking how great Santa Ana is, and it's showing all the, they have a bank that has so many millions of dollars in it, and testimonials of how, so-and-so's orchard produced more and more every year. And this book was kind of neat. This book was written in 1887. And back then it's called History of Santa Ana Valley because that was before we were Orange County. This area was called the Santa Ana Valley before it became Orange County. And in 1888, they stuck an original copy of this in a time capsule, and they put it in the cornerstone of the new county courthouse, which is now the old county courthouse, the sandstone building out there. But 100 years later, in 1988, they opened that time capsule, and then the Santa Ana Historical Society made copies of this. But it's a neat little booklet, yeah, and it kind of shows how they were really plugging people, people to come to Orange County. And as like you said, the railroads were really, really complicit in this too, because they own millions of acres of land that they got as land grants and they wanted to sell that. And so they not only sent pamphlets and booklets, but they would send land agents back to the Midwest, and they'd hold meetings and they'd even go into church congregations on Sundays and tell people, how great Southern California is. You can really make it out there. They even had at one point in the mid-1880s, they had a rate war, and you could go from the Midwest to Southern California for $1. And it was even dirt cheap for those days. And it was kind of funny. I was in here volunteering last month, and a lady brought in a stack of old newspapers, but there was also an old magazine in there. So I was paging through the magazine, and I came across a full-page ad, and I think it was for the Santa Fe Railroad, but all the ad said was California, where every month is June. So, we kind of laugh at that, maybe even snicker, because, with June gloom, we may not think that June is the ideal weather month for us. But then picture if you're a farmer in Kansas or Iowa or Nebraska in February, and you're looking at that ad, and then you look out your window and there's like 8 feet of snow and icicles dropping down. Year-round June probably sounded pretty good. So we don't know, for sure what the reason some of these men came in the 1880s, but, it's a probability that some of these ads got to them and they came out here. The 1890s, I said that was a national thing. And anybody, 1890s? Early 1890s? The Panic of 1892, which is what they called economic depressions. There was a terrible economic depression, and it was called the Panic of '92, but it lasted almost the whole decade. I mean, millions of people were out of work. Men were like roaming the roads, knocking on doors for handouts. Coxey's unemployed army, they marched across the country and marched on Washington, you know, looking for relief. How that ties in with men coming out here, you know, California has always been a place where people go to reinvent themselves, start over, make their fortunes, and quite a few of the Tustin veterans, they came out here in the 1890s and started over. So that once again, you know, unless we have a diary or a letter saying that, we just have to kind of guess why they would do that. But so now, I guess we'll start looking at some of the Civil War veterans. Some of the ones I thought would be more interesting. Their stories would be more interesting to look at. And I guess it's only fitting that we start with James Brown, since he started this whole thing with me. And this is James Brown. This is my, I told you I'm technically challenged. This is my idea of a PowerPoint presentation. Click there. There's James Brown as an older man. And he's the one I saw in the Gordon Bricken's book, and it said he won the Medal of Honor with the 20 also. And so I kind of did a lot of research on him and that Medal of Honor story. The Medal of Honor story goes on for like 50 years before it's resolved, and you'll see why in a few minutes. But James Henry Brown here, he was born in Boston in 1845 into a seafaring family. But when the war broke out, he was living in southern Maine, down near the New Hampshire border, right across from the Portsmouth Naval Yard. But he didn't enlist in the Navy, even though supposedly he was from a seafaring family. He enlisted as a private in the 27th Maine Infantry, and he did that in September of 1862. And it was a 9-month regiment, and that's really important to this whole story. So they trained for a little while in Maine, and then they went down to Washington. And they spent their entire 9 months just right outside of Washington in Arlington Heights, just guarding the Capitol. Never got a battle skirmish, and they just guarded the Capitol. So then on June 30th, 1863, their 9-month enlistment was ending. But up in Pennsylvania at this same time, Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia and Union Army of the Potomac were maneuvering, and they knew a big battle was coming, and they were in Pennsylvania, and the fear was that if Lee won, he was going to come down and take Washington. So these men are getting ready to be discharged the next day. So President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton, they sent a letter to the regiment asking him, you know, during this crisis, if they would just extend their service until the battle of was decided. So the colonel of the 27th Maine, he gathered the men all together that afternoon, and he read them the letter. And then, like, you know, good New England men, they, like a town meeting, they debated it for a while, and then they put it to a vote. And 150 of them said, no, we're going home. We served our time. We fulfilled our enlistment. We're going to go home. So they, the next day, they marched into Washington, got a train, and went back to Maine. But about 309 of them said they would stay. You know, they would stay and extend their enlistment until the crisis was passed. And we have to kind of assume James Brown was one of those 309, and you'll see why in a minute. So after they made that decision, Colonel Frank Wentworth, who was the colonel of he went on into Washington, and he met with Secretary of War Stanton, and he explained to them, he said, you know, I got 309 men. They agreed to stay. The rest of them are leaving. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Stanton said, oh, that's great. You know, we'll give those men the Medal of Honor for staying, you know. And if you ever read some about this, you'll see some people have written that they used it as an inducement beforehand, like when they asked them to stay, like, hey, we'll give you the Medal of Honor. But the only record of it really is when Stanton said, as an afterthought, kind of threw it in. And even if he had, at that time, tried to use it as an inducement, the men probably would have just gone like, you know, because at that time, the Medal of Honor was so new. It had just been authorized by Congress the year before. In fact, the first Congressional Medal of Honor had only been issued 3 months prior to this. So it didn't have the same, you know, it wasn't looked on the same way we look on it now. And the way he was able to do that is when Congress authorized that medal, it was supposed to be for gallantry in action with the enemy, but then they threw in a clause right after that, it said, or other soldier-like duties. So that opened up a whole, clause. So that's how they were able to do that. And so the 309 men stayed guarding Washington. The others left. Meanwhile, up in Pennsylvania, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd was the Battle of Gettysburg. And the Union Army won. Lee retreated back into Virginia. The capital was safe. So on July 4th, those remaining 300 men, they marched into Washington, got on the train, went back to Maine, and got discharged. So they basically won the Medal of Honor for extending their enlistment for 4 days. Yeah. So, but it was legal. I mean, it was, so in 1864, Stanton finally got around. He remembered, oh yeah, I got to give those guys their medal. So he sent a letter to, there's a mint in Philadelphia that struck all these medals. But the problem was, after June 30th, when Wentworth went back and he only had 309 men left, when they took the muster roll that day, they just took a count. They had 309 present, 550 absent, but they didn't write down anybody's name. So they had no list of who stayed and who left. So the 309 who were supposed to get it, they had no record of who those men were. So when Stanton, tried to get them to, that's a convoluted story. When Stanton sent that letter, the men didn't know who, who do we give them to? So they finally said, well, just make them for all of them. So they struck 864 medals of honor with each man's name and rank on it, put them in a case. Each one was in its own case. And then they put it in a great wooden crate and they shipped them up to the governor of Maine. And when the governor got them, he had no idea what these were for or what to do with them. This is in late 1864. So he wrote a letter to Colonel Wentworth, who was he was recovering because he had re-enlisted into a regiment that did see a lot of fighting. He was severely wounded. In fact, they sent him home thinking he was going to die, but he recovered. So the mayor contacted him, or the governor contacted him, and Wentworth said, well, just send them to me, I'll take care of it. So he shipped this big box of medals down to southern Maine. And Wentworth, he had no list either. So he was just going to go by memory. And he also sent letters to some of his company commanders, like, do you remember? So he pieced together this list of 300 or so men. And so then he started trying to dole them out, had their name on them. The 550 he kept, he just put in that box and he stuck it up on a shelf in the stable in back of his house. And it sat there for like 50 years, and then it disappeared. It's one of these mysteries. Nobody knows what happened to the 500 remaining medals of honor. So we'll put a pin in the Medal of Honor right here. Remember, we're at 1864, and we're going to go back to James Brown now, because he was mustered out back in July also after the crisis of Gettysburg passed. So he went back up to Maine. Don't know what he did for a few months there, but in December 1860, he re-enlisted. And this time he re-enlisted and he joined the cavalry. He joined the 2nd Maine Cavalry. And they were sent, at the start of 1860, they were sent down to Louisiana. And Louisiana had already been in control for quite some time. So there's no, once again, he's in no battles. They're just, doing patrols and scouting and like that. Oh, he joined when he was 17. So he's still like 18 years old doing this. And so he went with the cavalry in Louisiana, and then in 1864, then and then so right around the time they got to Pensacola, James Brown transferred to the Navy. So yeah, so he went from the infantry to the cavalry, and he joined the Navy, and he was assigned to a ship called the USS Manhattan, and it was a Monitor, one of the iron, the new iron battleship. If you remember, when the Monitor and the Merrimack fought of 1862, it was the first battle ever between two ironclad ships, and nobody really won because neither one could really hurt the other one. But they said when that happened, that day of that battle, every navy in the world was obsolete. So these were like the state-of-the-art naval ships at that time. And this is a Monitor, and the difference between an ironclad and a Monitor, there were a lot of ironclads, and what an ironclad was a wooden ship that they just put the metal, protection on. But these were built from the ground up as metal, iron battleships. And it was also very innovative. See, the entire ship was almost below the waterline, so there was nothing hardly for the enemy to shoot at except for the turret right there. And the turret was also a really big innovation because it rotated. You know, so on old ships, you had to maneuver the ship until your cannon were facing where you want, but with a movable turret, you didn't have to do a lot of maneuvering. The turret just turned. And it had two 15-inch cannons in it, which were the biggest guns of that time on ships. Okay. Yeah, and James Brown was a gunner's mate on this ship, which would have been in the turret manning one of those cannons. They had 14-man crews. It took 14 men to man one of those 15-inch cannons. It had a 350-pound shell that fired, and they used 35 pounds of gunpowder to do it. The turret was just like a hydraulic thing. It just, turned. And so it was very innovative for warfare, but it was terrible to live on, to be the crew of. It was miserable because everybody's living under the water line. And so all the air had to be sucked in with ventilator fans. So there was never enough air. And then you see all the smoke. When you're in battle, the smoke all got sucked down there too. And after a very short time, it said you couldn't see your hand in front of your face down there. And I read one account where a man said in the wintertime, serving on one of these ships was like living down in a mine. The walls were always wet. Everything was mildew, cold. And then conversely, in the summertime, he said it was like living in a Dutch oven. It was like the heat was unbearable. So the crew, they had a big turnover in the crews of these ships. And that's probably why James Brown was able to transfer onto it like that. And so he went from serving in the 21st Maine, where they had no battles, no skirmish, then in the cavalry, where they didn't fight at all. And then very shortly after signing on with this ship, he was involved in the Battle of Mobile Bay, September of 1860. It was one of the biggest naval battles of the Civil War. And the USS Manhattan was the second ship into the bay in that battle. And the first ship in was its sister ship, the Tecumseh, that was built right next to it. And the Tecumseh hit an underwater mine, which they called torpedoes in those days. So it hit an underwater mine, and it just, within minutes, it sank and lost most of the crew. It was the biggest loss of any single ship in the Civil War. So the Manhattan was to be the next ship in. And, but Admiral Farragut, on his flagship, he put up the order, everybody full speed. And one of his men, this is where that famous saying came in, one of his men says, "Well, sir, what about the torpedoes?" And that's when Farragut said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." And the first ship full speed ahead in was the Manhattan with James Brown on it. And they met right away. They kind of squared off with the Confederates' biggest, most powerful ship. It was an iron. It wasn't, they didn't have monitors, but it was an ironclad ram called the CSS Tennessee. And they just started pounding away at each other, with their cannon. They were at short distance. And finally, the commander of the Manhattan, he ordered the men to use 50 pounds of powder instead of 35 to get more, power on the shells. It was against regulations, and it was very dangerous. I mean, if the cannon had blown up in that turret, it probably would have wiped out everybody in it. But fortunately for them and for Brown, it worked, and they just started puncturing holes through the other ship and, causing havoc. And finally, it ran up the white flag and surrendered. So the Manhattan, with James Brown out, they captured the biggest, most powerful ship in the Confederate fleet at that battle. And as a bonus, on that ship was Admiral Buchanan. He was commanding the Confederate naval forces of the Confederates. So he kind of got thrown right in the fire, James Brown. And it was just a complete victory for the Union Navy. They either sunk or captured every Confederate ship in Mobile Bay. But the battle went over at the entrance of the bay. There was still a Confederate fort. And it took about over 2 weeks of them just shelling that fort for it to sit there. And what they would do, because the ironclads were more resistant, if they had brought the wooden ships in close enough, the cannons on the fort would. So they would send these monitors in close but then they took a heck of a beating because, they said it would be like being in a trash can, someone banging it. Guys would get concussions because it wouldn't damage or sink the ship, but you have these shells banging up against. One ship, they said, took 600 hits, and I saw a picture of it, had these dents all through it. But it took about 2.5 weeks, but then they finally finished. So the rest of James Brown and the Manhattan's service during the war was just in blockade. They blockaded the mouth of the Red River down in the Gulf of Mexico, trying to keep the Confederates from bringing in or sending out any cotton or supplies. That was a big part of the Navy. One of their main things was blockading all the southern ports. And when they took Mobile Bay in that battle, there was only one port left open to the Confederates, and that was in Wilmington, North Carolina. And that fell the next year anyway. So Brown, he finished out his naval service. He stayed, I think, one more year after the war. But when the war ended, he had gone through all this, and he was still only 20 years old at that time. So then after the war, he stayed at sea. He became a mate on a sailing ship called the Flying Cloud. And I'm pretty sure that's probably how he ended up in California. Because by 1868, he was living in Bodega up in Sonoma County, and he was working as a lumberman. He was living in a lumber camp bunkhouse with 26 other men. And he stayed up there for about the next 2 decades. He was a lumberman up in Bodega, Sonoma. And he came down to Southern California about 1889. But the first record I find of him in Tustin is voter registration in 1892. And then in 1895, he married Sarah Goodwin here in Tustin. He was 50 years old, and she was 36. They never had children. But they lived the rest of their lives right down, like I said, right down there on 3rd and Pacific, in her house on 3rd and Pacific. So now we'll go back to the Medal of Honor story picks back up right here, because about the time James Brown came to Southern California, to Tustin, an organization was formed back east called Medal of Honor Legion. And that was open to any living Medal of Honor winner who won it for gallantry in action. And they would not let the men of the 27th Maine join their organization. In fact, they started to openly lobby for them to have those medals revoked. And they tried several times, and 2 times the Army's Adjutant General Office, they did it, and they investigated, and they came back and they told them, look, you know, these medals obviously don't live up to our standards for the medal now, but they were perfectly legal when they did, so there's nothing we can do about it. But then in 1897, President McKinley, he actually ordered the Army to take that clause out that said other soldierly duties. So it became strictly for gallantry in action. So, but then it didn't end there. In 1916, someone slipped into a war preparedness bill, because remember, we're getting close to World War I now. They slipped into a war preparedness bill, a review board, and they were going to review all the Medal of Honors and decide if they were justified or not. And so they got 5 retired Army generals, and they reviewed every Medal of Honor recipient. And they came out with their findings, and they felt that 911 Medals of Honor were not justified and should be revoked. And of those were all 864 of the ones given to the 27th Maine. So there were also a couple other interesting people included in that. Like the only woman ever to win the Medal of Honor, her name was Dr. Mary Walker. And they revoked her medal too on the grounds that you had to be a service member, and she was a civilian contractor, a civilian employee of the Army. So they revoked her Medal of Honor. And Buffalo Bill Cody, he had won the Medal of Honor as an Indian scout during the Indian Wars, but he was a civilian scout, so they took his medal too. So after they came out with this ruling, the Adjutant General's office, he sent out a letter, and there was 103 men from the 27th Maine still alive in 1916. And he said, the Adjutant General's office, they sent out a letter, and they explained the decision, and they asked the men to send the medals back. They asked them to return them. But they warned them, if you don't return your medal, that it's against the law. It's a misdemeanor crime for you to wear or display in public in any way. Now, we don't know who was going to enforce that, but they did tell them that. And Buffalo Bill, he died a week before this decision came out, so to his grave, I think it was a medal. But Dr. Mary Walker just know that it. Every day for the rest of her life, when she went out in public, she wore her Medal of Honor. And she lived for 3 years, and as far as I know, nobody did anything to her. And actually in 1977, President Carter reinstated her Medal of Honor. So there is a female. But all the other ones, their names were stricken from the Medal of Honor rolls. Now you can see James Brown here is an older man. See, he's wearing his medal, so he either didn't get the letter or he chose to ignore it. So when he passed away in 1935. He was 90 years old. He was Tustin's last living Civil War veteran, and he had been the post commander of the GAR post for the previous 8 years. And when he passed away, only 4 men left. So when they did his ceremonies at San Cemetery, sons had a perform the ceremony, the 21-gun salute. The register had a picture of the men doing the 20 for him. And I found out, I think why they said he was from Orange in this book is because there was a little blurb in the register saying his funeral was going to be at a chapel in Orange. But they moved it there because they were expecting so many people. They wanted a bigger venue for it because I guess he was a popular guy, president or the commander of the post. So the Medal of Honor story is not over yet. So he passes away, and his wife donates his Medal of Honor to the Adventist Christian Church up here on Main and Pacific. That had been their church, you know. So she donated to him, and they put it on display in a little chapel there. So it was on display for 80 years. So unwittingly, the church was bringing law for 80 years. When I saw that, I got excited. When I read about it, I went down there. It's no longer on display, and we talked to someone down there, and they said it only was taken down about 3 years ago. I've been trying to find out. The previous pastor had been a member of the Sons of the Union Sold Veterans, and so I heard something. He took it down and was going to put it in one of those shadow boxes or something, but it's gone. And I've spoken to a couple people. And my last contact, I spoke to the secretary there on the phone and kind of explained it. And she said, well, we have a bunch of stuff in storage. I'll look for it and get back to you. But she's never gotten back to me. But I just thought if they have it and they don't want to put it back, it would be great for the museum, loan it or donate it to the museum to have on display there. Yeah. Did they? Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'm going to follow that. Okay. I'm going to follow that up then upstairs. Okay. Because nobody that we talked to really knew what was going on with that. And so that's the story of James Brown. If anybody is interested more in that whole Civil War story, there's a great book. It's called Shower of Stars, the Medal of Honor in the 27th Maine. It's completely about the whole. And it also gives a great history of the Medal of Honor and just military decorations in general in the United States. At first, the U.S. Army didn't want to give out medals because they thought it was too European. You know, we're democratic. We don't, you know, everybody's the same. But of course, it evolved after that. But it's a great book. This guy, John J. Pullen, was kind of the historian for Maine in the Civil War. He wrote a great book about the 20th Maine, which was, if you've ever seen the movie Gettysburg with Jeff Daniels, that was the 20th Maine, and he wrote a book about them too that was really good. So. But anyway, that's James Brown. Thought that was that whole Medal of Honor story I thought was quite interesting. Yeah.
Is he buried locally?
He's buried right at Santa Ana Cemetery. And the interesting thing too is, so he was in the infantry, he was in the cavalry, and he won the Medal of Honor, and he was the president or commander of the GAR, Grand Army, but his tombstone says James Brown, U.S. Navy. So I don't know if they go by like the last service you were in or how they decided what he would have on his tombstone, but it does say U.S. Navy, but not any of his earlier units. So, excuse me, not used to speaking so much at one time. So our next veteran is Charles F. Bennett, and he'd fit in right good nowadays with beards being back in, but yeah, he's back in style. This is Charles Franklin Bennett, and he was born in Kent, Connecticut in 1842. And he was from a really old New England family. They could trace their lineage back like to the Pilgrims, to the Mayflower. And he had a great-grandfather, Isaac Bennett, who was one of the contractors that built the Erie Canal. So he came from kind of a prominent family. And then as a boy back in New England, he was introduced to the anti-slavery principles of some of the leading abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, through his father. And then when his father moved the family to LaSalle, Illinois, he was able to put some of those principles into practice. He used to help runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad to go from one station to the next. And on just a little side note, if you're ever in Cincinnati, I was there last month, they have a great, my buddy Paul and I went on a history road trip. They have a great Underground Railroad museum in Cincinnati. And they also, because southern Ohio was right on the border, the Ohio River between Ohio and Kentucky, a slave state, there's a lot of old Underground Railroad houses that you can tour. It's very interesting. So, so he helped run away slaves on the Underground Railroad, and also as a young man in Illinois, he was able to meet John Fremont, who was the first Republican candidate for president in 1856, and he also met Abraham Lincoln when he was a young man. So Charles, he was preparing to enter the University of Chicago when the war broke out, and so he dropped his educational plans, and at the age of 19, he enlisted as a private in the 55th Illinois Infantry Regiment. And a good friend of his in the regiment with him throughout the whole war was a man named Johnny Beach, and Beach would end up being his brother-in-law and business partner, future business partner. And the 55th Illinois, they participated in most of the major campaigns in the Western Theater during the war. And just a little explanation, you know, the Eastern Theater was considered all the battles that took place in Virginia, you know, all those big battles. And it was usually Lee's Army in Northern Virginia against the Army of the Potomac. And then this is, you know, this is a generalization, but for the most part, especially early in the war, the Confederates had the upper hand in the East. You know, they were winning most of the battles. But in the Western Theater, the Union armies did much better. You know, they won a lot of early victories. Donelson, Grant, Vicksburg. A lot of it, I think, had to do with leadership. You know, the Southerners in the Eastern Theater, they had Ray Lee and Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet. But in the West, the Union Army had Grant. They had Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman, Sheridan. So I think a lot of it came down to leadership. I don't think it was necessarily any fighting men were better than the others. It was just how well they were led in these battles. But Charles Bennett, he spent his entire Army Civil War service in the Western Theater, and he fought at Shiloh, Corinth, the Vicksburg campaign. These were all major battles. Lookout Mountain, the Battle of Atlanta, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, Jonesboro, and then he also participated in Sherman's March to the Sea. So in all, by the end, he was a first sergeant. He had been promoted to first sergeant, and he had participated in 32 major engagements in the war. And he had been slightly wounded several times, but nothing real serious. But there was also a report that there were times when his hair was clipped, his coat was shredded, and his hat band was cut off his head during the war. So he was in the thick of the fighting. He was in a lot of serious fighting. He served the entire 4 years, and when he got to sergeant, at one time, one of the fondest memories of when he was in the war was when he was in charge of a guard detail. He was inside the building with General Grant, General Sherman, and General Logan when they were planning the final stages after Sherman's March to the Sea. So he thought that was in company with those famous generals. And Logan, by the way, supposedly he's the one who the Logan Barrio in Santa Ana is named after. It had nothing to do with the Civil War services because he was a railroad executive at the time and was going to do that. And then Bennett was at the Appomattox. He witnessed Lee's surrender to Grant. And by the end of the war, the 55th Illinois, having served all 4 years, they ended up having 286 total fatalities, casualties in there. 127 of those were men who died of disease. Disease actually killed more men in the Civil War than bullets ever did. And although he was never seriously wounded, the years of continuous service, sleeping out in tents or on the ground and being wounded several times, although not seriously, took a toll on his health. So after the war, he returned to LaSalle, to the family farm, to rest and recuperate. And then after years better, he moved to Chicago and he tried selling real estate. His passed away. He returned to the family farm. And then in 1872, he helped Beach, the sister of buddy in the Army. She was all from Connecticut. She was from a town a mile where he was in Connecticut. So they were married in 1872, and then it's either late 1877 or early 1878. I couldn't pinpoint the time, but they moved to Arapahoe, Nebraska, which is a little town in southern Nebraska, kind of near the Oklahoma border. And they did really well there. They raised cattle and sheep, and they also ran a hotel. He had a nursery, a lumber yard, and a mercantile business. I mean, he was basically a big fish, a little pond in Arapahoe. He became involved in local politics and helped the commander of the local AAR post there in Arapahoe. So he was, doing quite well. And once again, this is one of those things like, why did he move then to California in 1885? But of course, that was right at the time we talked about the land boom in 1885. But for some reason, with all this going on in Nebraska, he pulled up stakes and they moved to Southern California in 1885. They first went to Oceanside, and he bought some acreage in Oceanside. But the year after they got here, his wife Helen, she came up here to Tustin, and some friends they had known from Nebraska had moved to Tustin. And she got up here and she just really liked the area. And so she went back and she talked him into selling the property and moving in Oceanside and moving to Tustin. It took a little bit of time, but by 1887 they had moved to Tustin. And they purchased 10 acres right up on Tustin Avenue here. And they built a nice house, sat back from the street, and they planted an orchard. orange orchard, and they lived there the rest of their life. And here's their house on Tustin. It's a nice, that's Charles and Helen, and you can see there's like a fountain there. It was right where Tustin Avenue, where Fruit Street runs into Tustin Avenue. Kind of not at the hospital, but where the medical buildings are. That was their property right there. And they had 4 children. And 1 month after the last one was born, their only daughter, Pearl, she was riding a horse out in their orchard up there, and she got thrown from the horse and killed. She was just a little month shy of being 12 years old, their only daughter. And one thing I found as I was doing this research, there were a lot of accidents and a lot of death people dealt with in those days. And so that was one of theirs. Well, here, once he got here, Charles got involved in politics here also. And I was shocked when I read it, because here's a guy that was a former abolitionist. He helped slaves escape. He was a Union Army veteran from Illinois. He'd met Lincoln. He was a Democrat. He wasn't a Republican. I mean, most Union Army veterans, especially from Illinois, but it said he was a staunch Democrat. In 1892, he ran for a seat in the state assembly, and it was on a fusion ticket. It said he depended on votes from both sides, but he got elected, and he served 1 term in the state assembly. And then when he came back here, he decided to, he didn't live there permanently, just during when it was in session. But when he got back and was through with politics, he just concentrated on expanding his orchard operation. So initially he bought 10 acres in El Toro, and eventually that expanded to 60 acres and 10 town lots, or 5 or 10 town lots. They were one of the early settler, people who in El Toro, although they still lived in Tustin. In fact, he ended up commuting to oversee his properties from Tustin to El Toro, and he had a large apiary in El Toro. And about 1910, he suffered a bad bout of pneumonia, so he turned the El Toro property over to his son Harvey. And but the year previous, he had a nice on the property. It's a craftsman bungalow. And then his son moved into that house, and his son eventually married a gal from Santa Ana, and they raised their family. They lived there. His son became a real prominent, one of the early members in El Toro. And you can actually tour the house. It's part of the Heritage Hill Historic Park in El Toro, so you can go through the Bennett house. It's a neat craftsman bungalow out there. You can go there, take a tour. They also have like an old schoolhouse, an old church, and then 3 old ranch houses you can tour through there. It's really neat, so if you ever get a chance. So he just can, he also, Charles, then he became an acknowledged expert on irrigation, orchard irrigation. He actually represented Orange County in several national irrigation conventions, so he became quite a prominent, Tustin and Orange County grower. And he passed away in 1921 at the age of 79. And he's buried in Santa Ana Cemetery. The Sedgwick Post of the GAR acted as his pallbearers and did the service. And then Helen, she stayed at their house. She lived at that house. She loved it there. She used to write poems. She wrote one time about how much she loved her orchard and living in that house. And she stayed there until 1948, and she died at 96 in 1948 and stayed there. And I think it was their son Charles, Steve knew, then he had lived with her for some time. I don't know when this house was torn down. I don't know when it was you saw him, but that was another prominent veteran that moved to Tustin. I'll get to one. I'll get to one rebel eventually. Yeah.
How they kept that quiet?
Yeah. So this is George Hubbard, and he's the next Tustin Civil War veteran we'll look at. And he had an interesting Civil War career too. He was another New Englander. He was from Putney, Vermont. And he was born there in 1832, and he grew up working on the family farm. But then in 1852, he must have got gold fever because he came to California. He's the only veteran I've seen so far that I've researched that actually was in California before the war. So he took a sailing ship around to Panama. No canal at that time, of course, so walked across, or however he got across to the other side, took another ship up the coast to California. But the interesting thing is, he didn't go to the gold fields. He worked on a farm outside of San Jose for a year. I don't know, maybe he was trying to earn money to get his prospecting tools and stuff, but it only lasted a year, and his California venture was kind of cut short. He received word that his father had died back east, so he returned home to help support the family, so he went back. So he was only out here for a short time. So he's back. The family had moved to New York, and in 1857 he married one, and they lived and they had a farm in upstate New York. It's like Malone, New York, where they lived, is like 10 or 15 miles from the Canadian border. I mean, it's really upstate. And they had a son in 1859. So Hubbard was married. He was married 3 years old with a young son when he enlisted. And he enlisted as a private in the 16th New York Infantry Regiment in August of 1862. And he enlisted for 3 years. And even though he enlisted in August of 1830, he was not mustered in. He didn't join the regiment till October 5th. But the 16th New York had been organized the year before as a two-year regiment. So he was kind of catching up to him after that. So he missed all of the action. The 16th New York, they fought in the thing called the Peninsula Campaign when Union General McClellan, he was trying to take Richmond, didn't work out, he wasn't involved in that because he hadn't joined yet, but the regiment was. And then he actually joined the regiment a couple weeks after they had been at the Battle of Antietam. And the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, it's still the single bloodiest day in U.S. military history. More men were killed on that day than even in D-Day. But George there, he missed that by a couple weeks. He wasn't with the regiment yet. So the first big battle that he did participate in with his regiment was the Union defeat at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. And Fredericksburg was just another one of those bad Union defeats and bad leadership. The Union General Burnside, he just kept ordering men to charge up this slope where the Confederates were behind stone walls, and they just were slaughtered. He just kept ordering charge after charge. But fortunately for George Hubbard and the 16th New York, they were not involved in that. They were on picket duty, kind of on the outskirts of the battle, so they were never involved in those attacks. So they avoided that slaughter. So he was fortunate. They did suffer. The regiment did suffer through. After the battle, there was a thing called the Mud March, and that's when General Burnside tried to move the army. And it had torrential rains. Of course, there were no paved roads. And there were stories of wagons sinking to their axles, mules completely disappearing in the mud. I mean, it was horrendous. And he was involved, and his regiment was involved in that mud march. And they then went into their quarters. And not much happened during the war and most of the winter for either side. But then on May 3rd and 4th of 1864, his regiment was involved in the Battle of Salem Church, and that was kind of part of the Chancellorsville campaign, which was another big defeat in the East. And his regiment suffered 20 killed, 87 wounded, and 49 men missing in that one battle. That was the only big battle he was involved with the 16th New York, because 2 weeks after that battle, the 16th New York, those men who had signed up for 2 years, their enlistment was up. So they just disbanded the whole regiment. But men like George Hubbard and some other men who had signed up later for 3 years, they weren't going to just let them go home, so they transferred them into another regiment. So they transferred into the 121st New York Infantry. And the 121st, it would go on to have one of the finest service records in the Army of the Potomac. If you've ever read Bruce Catton's Pulitzer Prize winning Stillness at Appomattox, he talks about them a lot, and their commanding officer, Emory Upton. And they were in the thick of a lot of fighting. But at first, Hubbard was still kind of lucky, because a couple weeks after joining the 121st, they were at the Battle of Gettysburg, biggest battle of the war. And his unit was held in reserve. So even though they were at the battle, right in the middle of the battlefield, they never got into action. They suffered no casualties whatsoever. So his luck was still kind of holding. He missed, up to this point, he'd missed the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day. They missed the slaughter at Fredericksburg. They were held in reserve at Gettysburg. So he kind of was living a charmed existence in his military career so far. The following year, though, General Grant took over command of all the Union armies. And even though General Meade was still technically in charge of the Army of the Potomac, Grant actually was running it. And Grant, unlike all these other unsuccessful Union generals, when he would fight a battle, win or lose, he would not withdraw. He would just move around and attack them again. So in the spring of 1864, Hubbard here and the 124th 21st New York, they were just involved in one major battle after another. Some of them were only a week or days apart, but tremendous casualties. He was never wounded, but they fought at the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Battle of North Anna, and they were in on the big assault, first great assault on Petersburg before they went into a siege. And I mentioned Spotsylvania, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Their commanding officer was General John Civic, who the GA post here in Santa Ana was named after. And at that battle, he was riding up on his horse, and one of the men said, "Well, be careful, General, in those trees." He said, "Oh, they couldn't hit an elephant distance," and those were his final words. Moments a bullet hit under the left eye and killed him. And he's, like I said, he's who they named their GAR post here in Santa Ana after. So in the summer of '64. The rebel, a Confederate General, Jubal Early, he kind of made a move like he was going to attack Washington. So Grant detached the 6th Corps that Hubbard and the 121st New York were in and sent them to stop him. And they had a fight at this battle called Fort Stevens, and they stopped Early. And then the Confederate forces went up into the Shenandoah Valley. And then the Union forces followed them up there. And that's kind of where George Hubbard's luck ran out, because up in the Shenandoah Valley, he got captured. He got captured by Confederate forces. And there's conflicting accounts about his capture. I read in his obituary and in a 1911 biographical sketch that's in one of the books, it said he was captured at the Battle of Strasburg, which was August 17th, 1864. But when I started researching it, the 121st New York wasn't at the Battle of Strasburg. It was a very small battle, and there were Jersey regiments there on the Union side. So unless he was like detached from his regiment or straggling behind, the official regimental records, they say he was captured at Middleburg, Virginia about a month later on September 24th. Regardless, he was captured and sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, which was one of the most notorious.
What rank is
he was Libby Prison was for officers, but he was a private, yeah. And so depending on when he was captured, he either was there for 2 months or a couple weeks, because in the first week of October, he was transferred out of there. But Libby Prison was probably one of the most notorious southern prison camps next to Andersonville in Georgia. It was a 3-story brick warehouse building. It was right on the James River in Richmond. And the top 2 floors were used for the prisoners. And the windows had bars on them, but no glass, so it was open to the elements. And it was overcrowded, and the men didn't get enough to eat. And so the mortality rate was very high. So he got transferred to Salisbury, North Carolina, first week of October. And he was there with 1,000 other men. And I'm not sure if that was an improvement over Libby Prison, because that raised the total at Salisbury to 10,000 men. And it was very overcrowded too. And it actually rose the mortality rate there from 2% to 28% of the men died. And then most of them were just buried in mass graves. There's a military cemetery there now for those men. But prison conditions were deplorable on both sides. I mean, the Southerners weren't alone in having terrible prisons. Like I said, my buddy Paul and I went to Ohio last month, and before we left, Donna told us about a Confederate cemetery in the middle of Ohio, so we had to check that out. And it's actually in Columbus, the capital of Ohio. There's a Confederate cemetery, and it was a former prison camp, and there's 2,260 men buried in there that died of disease while in that camp. It's very moving. And you can tell it's military because the headstones are all lined up perfectly. And when you look on the left, they're unknown, they're all blank. But on the right, actually the person's name. And there's a nice archway with a soldier on top. And it says American. But from what I read for years, it used to say Confederate. And then somebody said, well, you know, we're all American now. And they changed it and they made it into American. But it was very moving, and you would not think that there would be a Confederate cemetery in the middle of Ohio. But overall, through the course of the war, approximately 55,000 men died in prison camps, both North and South. About 30,000 Northerners, 25,000 Southerners. So George Hubbard, he survived 6 months in conditions in Salisbury Prison. And then right before the war ended in March of 1865, he was paroled. And then he went back to his the remainder of his enlistment and was mustered out in June of 1865. And so he returned to civilian life in the summer of 65 after serving 3 years and 6 months and then 6 months of those in a prison camp. And his health must have been affected because in 1877 he applied and received disability pension from the government. So he returned to the farm in Malone and to his wife, and they had another child. They only had 2 children. They had a daughter after that. And they remained up there farming in Malone for about the next 15 years. But either the lure of California, maybe he wanted to go back and finish off his California venture, or maybe those winters up near the Canadian border got to him, because in 1883 he sold all his New York property. He put his family on a train. This time, no sailing ships. This time, you could take a train. And they moved out to California 30 years after he had left here. And they ended up. He must have done well. He must have done well selling with his property back in New York, because when he came to Tustin, he was able to purchase 40 acres on Laguna Road, and he also bought a town block of 12 lots in the town itself. And he planted his Laguna Road is what El Camino is now, that runs east and west, for those who don't know. It used to be called Laguna Road, that part of El Camino. So in that acreage, those 40 acres, he planted oranges, apricots, walnuts, and he also planted oranges in his town lot here too. And he did very well. They bought a house actually in town here. It's on the corner of 3rd and A Street. It's still there. It was built in 1876, and the property at one time was owned by Barbara Lewis, who was the sister of Columbus Tustin, the town founder. And they lived in that house the rest of their life. And the Tustin Historic House Register still calls it the Hubbard House. And their daughter Emma died in that house in 1894. She was only 26 years old. And then 6 years later, his wife Marcia, she passed away there. She was 65. And Marcia's sister, widowed sister, was living with them at the time. Maybe she was helping to take care of her. But shortly after that, George married her. He married her sister. And yeah. And he maintained his orchard business, but as he got older, he turned it over to his son Clinton. His son Clinton then ran it. And I got a kick on the 1900 federal census. George's occupation is listed as capitalist. So I thought he embraced the conservative philosophy of his adopted county. But he passed away at the age of 90 in 1922, and he's buried next to his first wife in Fairhaven there. And then Alice, his second wife, she stayed on at the house there on A Street, and she lived with her daughter from the first marriage, Clara, and their name was Macomber. And Clara Macomber taught at Tustin High School for almost 25 years. She was a teacher in the first class at Tustin High, 1921, and she taught until about 1944. And I looked her up in the yearbooks we have back here, and I got a kick out of it. They either repurposed her picture every year, or she never aged, because everyone I looked at, it looked like the exact same picture. But and also here in the museum, George's grandson, Ernest, his picture's up on the wall over there. He's the second from the bottom on the right in the white shirt, Ernest Hubbard with the fire department. That's George's grandson there. So they stayed in the Tustin area and were part of Tustin. So that is George Hubbard. And if anybody has any questions, if I'm on any of this, just feel free to jump in.
Did you outline any of this? I know there were people that moved to this town because of health. It was warmer.
Oh yeah. That was part, yeah.
A lot of people moved back after the war because they
I'm sure that was part of the inducements when they would send those pamphlets and things back. They would tell me, come out here and you'll feel, the climate here is good for. Yeah, I'm sure some people, possibly moved out here for their health. Yeah. Our next Tustin Civil War veteran, I was very excited. I finally found one in his Civil War uniform. This is Horace C. Snow. And the infamous Horace Snow. And his Civil War service is not, is not near as interesting. I don't think as exciting as this, but I did find it fascinating that here he is. He's in his lieutenant's uniform. He was an officer. He eventually, and I'll show you that, he eventually became an officer of a colored regiment. They call them colored regiments. The regiments were black soldiers. They all had only white officers, and he was one of those. And there were 2 million men over the course of the war that served in the Union Army, but only 7,000 white officers and black regiments. One of them ends up in Tustin, of all places. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I thought we'd look at his life. He was from New England also. He was born in 1831 in a small town in upper New Hampshire called Whitefield. And his father had 7 children with his first wife, and then she died. He married Horace's mother and had 7 more. And Horace was the oldest surviving son of the second marriage. And he was raised there in Whitefield, but maybe he wanted to get away from that mob because in the early 1850s he moved to Iowa on his own and lived in a little town called Osage, Iowa. But he returned to New England. In 1857, he returned to New England to Massachusetts, and he married a woman named Emily Lawrence in a town called Ashburnham. That sounds very New England. Worcester, Massachusetts. And then he brought her back to his place in Iowa. And they had a son, Alfred, but sadly he died at 5 months old in 1858. And then a little over a year later, Emily passed away. She was only 25. And he shipped both their bodies back to Massachusetts to be buried together, probably maybe at the family cemetery. So he was a 30-year-old widower when he enlisted in 13th U.S. Infantry in 1862. The 13th U.S. Infantry, unlike these other ones we looked at, it wasn't a state regiment. It was actually a regular army. It had existed before the war. And before the war, at one point, it had been commanded by William Sherman, Philip Sheridan. They both went on to be famous Union generals. So it was a regular army unit. It must have been stationed at Duquesne, Iowa, because that's where he enlisted at. And when he first joined, they were just doing garrison duty, like in a fort. They were in Illinois, and then they were in garrison duty in Memphis. But then in the spring of 1863, they went down to Mississippi, and they were part of the campaign to take Vicksburg. One of the goals of the Union forces during the war is they wanted to gain control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in half. They wanted to blockade their ports, split the Confederacy in half, and take Richmond. They did a good job of blockading the ports. They split it in half, but they didn't take Richmond until like a week before the war ended. But that was what this campaign that the 13th Infantry, along with Horace Snow, were involved in. So there were several battles, small battles that aren't really well known, that he was involved in leading up to that. And then Vicksburg sits on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi, and it was fortified. And so they tried to frontal attack and assault it on May 19th, 1863, and the 13th Regiment was part of that assault. And it failed because it was just too fortified. But the 13th Infantry is reckoned as being the only Union regiment that actually was able to plant their flag at the top of the Union breastworks, but then they were beaten back. And then it just went into a siege. They surrounded the city, cut off anything going in and out. It took about 2 months. They were basically starving the people out. I mean, there are stories about people catching rats and frying them to eat. They were so hungry. They were living in caves and stuff. But eventually, finally, on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. And so the Confederacy was effectively cut in half. And incidentally, the city of Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July for the next 82 years. They didn't take that well. They didn't forget. So during his stint with the 13th Infantry, Horace Snow got promoted. He became a commissary sergeant, which was a non-combat position. He basically was like a supply sergeant. He was in charge of receiving and receiving, storing, distributing supplies and that. He remained with a regiment for the remainder of 1863 up until August of 1864. On August 31st, 1864, he was mustered out of the regiment. And then the very next week, he was commissioned the first lieutenant in the 45th Colored Infantry Regiment back in Philadelphia. So, and the 45th was one of the colored regiments. It was organized in Philadelphia, and it was recruited from free black from the north and former slave from the south. And like I said, all the enlisted men were black, all the officers were white. At that time, they just didn't think black men were capable of, leading other people. A lot of people didn't even want them to be armed and fight. I mean, it was a long battle to get them to start recruiting black soldiers. Even when the war began, abolitionists and black leaders like Frederick Douglass, they were calling on Lincoln to, use this manpower. They want to fight for their own freedom. But it took about 18 months for the Lincoln administration to finally agree and start recruiting black soldiers. Part of the reason was their manpower was starting to drop. They had just they had to send troops from Gettysburg, just fought in Gettysburg, to put down this riot in New York City. So they figured, well, here's men that want to fight, we'll give them a shot. I always, I didn't know much until I started researching. I didn't know, I assumed maybe that being an officer in a black regiment wasn't like a really sought after thing because of the stereotypes and the racial prejudice. But actually it was very sought after to get a commission. And there are a couple reasons for that. One, it was a quick promotion. And along with that promotion, a pay raise. So there were men who wanted to do it. But there were also a lot of men who wanted to do it for idealistic reasons. There were a lot of men who had been, like we've talked about, who had supported abolition, freeing the slaves. Well, here was their chance to do something about it. So what they did was they formed there was a thing called the Bureau of Colored Troops was established. And their job was to screen these candidates who wanted to be officers in black regiments. And the Bureau wanted, and this is a quote, they wanted only intelligent white men with high morals who were willing to make a commitment to uplifting the black race. They wanted only the best people to run these black regiments. And the difference in the Civil War, especially early on, a lot of the regiments, the officers were either picked by the men or just appointed because they were good at recruiting men. They didn't necessarily have any military knowledge or ability whatsoever, and that's probably why there was such poor leadership early in the war. But they wanted these black units to be run by, qualified men. So instead of just appointing or electing them, they actually, the white officers who applied to be white officers in a black regiment, they had to actually pass an exam and they had to have an interview. And only about 60% of the men could pass the exam, and of those, only about a quarter of them actually were picked and commissioned. So this led the Army to establish a school in Philadelphia to help these men study for the test. And that was the precursor to the Army's officer candidate school. That's kind of where that whole thing started. And I don't know, but I'm guessing maybe that Horace Snow may have been detached from his 13th Infantry Regiment early and went through that school. Either that or he was a really sharp guy and passed that test because he was commissioned a week after he left, was mustered out of the 3rd. And the fact that he did it in Philadelphia, and that's where the school was. That school was in Philadelphia. So I can't know for sure, but it's a pretty good guess that he may have been detached from his infantry unit to go to that school, and then he was commissioned. The reason, one of the reasons they wanted these black regiments to succeed, not only for the war effort, but Lincoln thought that, maybe these men fighting for their own freedom and doing well, that it would combat some of those negative racial stereotypes that were prevalent in both the North and South. It wasn't just the South, And also, maybe if they fought for their own freedom, their path to full citizenship after the war. And so for that reason, they really wanted to get highly qualified, men to lead them in battle. But there were some dangers for not just for the black soldiers, but for their white officers, because when the Confederate government heard that they were starting to recruit and arm black, that was like one of their fears. And they let it be known that black soldiers or their white officers who were captured, they were not going to be treated under the Articles of War. They were either going to execute the black soldiers when they surrendered, or they were going to send them back into slavery. And they flat out said, we're going to execute the white officers. So you had that danger, if you wanted to be a white officer in a black regiment and help the cause, but you were also in danger. And there were instances where that did happen. But when it was found out, President Lincoln let it be known that if that did happen, then he would take the equal number and rank of Southern prisoners and take them out and execute them. And that kind of put a stop to that. There were some, the Fort Pillow Massacre is probably the most famous. That was a fort above Memphis that was manned by black troops, and it surrendered. And a couple hundred of them were killed trying to surrender. They were executed by force. Oh, we're running out of time? Okay. So anyway, so Horace Snow, he was still in Philadelphia, still in uniform when he married his wife. And they came out to California like very shortly after the war. But they ended up they went to the Bay Area first, right up, they were in Solano County, Vallejo, right above. And then he went up even further north to Humboldt. And it wasn't until 1882, came down to Tustin and bought an orchard, became an orchard and grower. And his brother had come here first. He had a brother, Hiram Snow, and he had come here first in 1877, so he kind of followed him down here. And there is a picture of the Snow house. Looks like some kind of family gathering. I counted like 14 people in that picture, along with babies and everything. How much time do I have, Steve?
Maybe 10 more minutes.
Ooh, okay, wow. All right, well, I can speed through this. This is the only Confederate. There were two. This is the only one I've done research so far. This was Peter T. Adams, and he was from Texas. And yeah, he was actually born in Tennessee, but his family moved to Texas when he was 2 years old in 1836. And that was the year of the Alamo. It was the year that Sam Houston led the Battle of San Jacinto for Texas independence. So they were very early pioneers in Texas. And he was the youngest of 8 brothers. And all of them served in the Texas Rangers before the war, because they moved to West Texas, west of San Antonio, and they had a cattle ranch. And they were always either dealing with Russ or the Native American tribes whose lands were being encroached upon, were fighting them. So they were always, he had one brother that was killed a couple months before the Civil War started. He had a brother that was killed in a clash with Native Americans. Another brother was in the same battle, was severely wounded but recovered. And then even after the war in 1875, he had another brother that was killed in a battle with Indians. So, but I do have to share with you, he had 7 older brothers, and here are some of the names of them. One brother was John Quincy Adams. The other was Daniel Webster Adams, Henry Clay Adams, James Monroe Adams, and Martin Van Buren Adams. And I was joking. I said maybe his parents ran out of famous statesmen when he came along, the 9th and final one, because they just named him Peter. But his service in the Civil War was kind of unique also, because he was in the Texas Rangers before the war, and then he joined a group called McCord's Frontier Regiment. And they basically did exactly the same thing that he was doing with the Rangers. They guarded the frontier settlements in Texas, because with all these men leaving Texas to go fight in the East, it kind of encouraged the Native American tribes, hey, let's go. And so that's basically what he did in this regiment. He did the same thing he was doing with the Rangers, was guarding the settlements and ranches. Eventually, they actually transferred them into the Confederate regular service, and basically it was a name change to the 46th Texas Cavalry, and they did the same thing. I don't think they ever fought Union forces. I think they just stayed on the frontier and guarded the settlements. And he was an early arrival. He came here in 1877. He moved here. He had a huge cattle ranch. He had like 100,000 cattle. Him and his brother on their ranch in Texas, and they used to drive them up to Kansas, like in the westerns. They drive their herds up to Dodge, Abilene, all these, and sell them. But for some reason, I don't know if that was taken enough. In 1877, he moved to Tustin. Now his wife's name was Henrietta Downs, and the Downs were some of the first people in Tustin. They're credited with building the first ever house in Tustin, so maybe that's probably why he ended up here. But and he became very prominent here. He was one of the first big walnut growers in the area, and became president of the Walnut Growers Association. So, and then here's his house, and it stayed there for long. They didn't tear this house down until 1964, and it's on where Williams Street is now, 55. If anybody knows, the 55,000 block, 100 block of Williams. But that was the Adams house, and I found it interesting. I found an article on it. They were tearing it down for a condo complex, but they didn't tear it down. They burned it down, and I don't know. The fire department did it. I don't know if they just needed practice with a controlled burn or what, but they burned the house down. But his one daughter and son-in-law were still living at that time, and they had lived in that house up till right about then. And it said they took the banister, they saved it because of all the memories of the grandkids and kids sliding down the banister. So they did save something from the house, and. He passed away. He lived to be 90 years old also. He passed away in 1924, and he's buried at Fairhaven. And just real quick, tying in, I'll finish up real quick, tying into the Veterans Day coming up. His grandson, Ralph Plum, his daughter married a man named Hugh Plum, who was a county tax assessor for years. But they had a son. They had 3 sons, but the middle son's name was Ralph. And he's on that poster right there. He was the first Tustin area man to die in World War II. He was lost in the Battle of the Coral Sea. It was one of the very early naval battles of World War II. In fact, it was the first naval battle in history where neither fleet saw each other. It was all done with aircraft. They never laid eyes on each other. And his ship was hit with bombs, and it eventually sank, and he was lost at sea. Are we good?
Can I have a question?
Sure.
How much material do you have? Could you a second time if we put it on again?
I have more people. By then I'll have 8 more guys I've researched. And I had like 8 more here that had little mini profiles. Yeah, if they want it, sure. Yeah. Part 2, okay. Oh, and real quick, if anybody's appetite has been whetted for Civil War, Southern California, there's a great place in Wilmington, Civil War Drum Barracks. It was the hub of Civil War activity, Union activity during the war. Everything went through there, and they have a museum. They take you on a guided tour on the 2nd and 4th Sunday of every month, and they do a really good job about telling you California's role in the Civil War. California? Oh, just right up here in Wilmington. Yeah, it's right by San Pedro. You could go to there in Osgood Battery at the same time. Oh, it's right up here. It's called the Drum Barracks. And it was the center. During the Civil War, there were a lot of Southern sympathizers in the Los Angeles area. And the government was afraid they were going to try to break away too. So they put this fort, this barracks there, and put a lot of Union troops there to keep an eye on them. But it was also, they would come in there and they would parcel these troops out to Arizona, New Mexico. It was the center for Union Army activity during the war. And they got a lot of great stuff. They got all kinds of Civil War weapons. Like I said, they do a good job of interpreting Civil War, California's role. It's called the Drum Barracks. Yeah, it's in Wilmington. They're open the 2nd and 4th Sunday of every month. And also right down the street, literally right down the street is the Banning Mansion. And you can tour that too, and I think it's open the same Sunday, so you could kind of...
They have a gift shop.
And they have a gift shop, yeah.
Has Brown been allowed to keep his Medal of Honor for that battle at Mobile?
I would say he earned his money there. Yeah, I would definitely say. And I did forget to put this in, and it's an amusing story to end with this. When I was saying how the Medal of Honor was not held in the esteem it is now, I saw a letter, a sailor. This was in 1865. He was already home from the war. He got a letter, and it said, "Congratulations, you're being awarded the Medal of Honor." It said, you should be proud. It said, some of your shipmates are actually envious of you. And then it said, you'll be receiving the medal in the mail shortly, and you'll be required to pay the 85 cents postage due. So, yeah. There was no going to the White House and having the president put it on you, yeah. So, yeah.
I just want to thank you and Vicki for the work that you're doing, because these men would just be names on paper.
Oh.
But by doing your research, you're really bringing their stories to life and creating a lasting legacy. I think.
Yeah, that's what I enjoy about any kind of research like that. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you.